Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Suzanne Kerr, Accounting and Business Solutions Director at Henderson Loggie, and I look after many charities on a day-to-day basis. In the last few years, there has been many challenges for charities and their employees with the pandemic, for both client-facing and non-client-facing roles, some of which have been done remotely. You may have encountered requests for different working patterns, or with the easing of restrictions, you may now be facing new questions from your workforce and having to reassess contracts of employment or working pattern requests, for example. There's been a lot of media attention talking about the Great Resignation, with folk reassessing their lives after the pandemic. There may be something your charity has experienced. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Fiona Doctor, HR Director of Henderson Loggie, who will be talking us through talent retention and the steps that you can take to retain your team in the new working world we live in. Also joining us is Jack Boyle, employment lawyer of Blackadder's. Jack is part of Blackadder's multi-award winning employment law team and will be looking at employment contracts, flexible working and common employment law pitfalls to look out for. Jack is also a trustee of Dundee Carers Centre. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so if you can please make use of the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat function, and we will respond to as many as we can. I will now pass over to Fiona Doctor.
Thanks, Suzanne. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I thought I would start by giving a brief general overview of the recruitment market and then talk through some key steps you may wish to consider for your own attraction and retention plans. The much publicised Great Resignation, or Great Reshuffle, as it's also being referred to, is one of the top issues facing leaders today. And I'm sure a number of you attending have experienced the impact of this. Employees are switching jobs at an unprecedented rate, not just in the UK, but globally. And businesses are experiencing high labour turnover rates of around 25 to 30%, depending on the sectors they operate in. And to put this into context, the average UK labour turnover rate for 2019 was around 16%. Hiring activity has risen sharply with robust demand for staff, and multiple industries across the UK are facing resource shortages. As a result, capacity has become one of the key constraints to growth. 77% of employers surveyed as part of the Hayes Spring 2022 Outlook highlighted difficulties accessing the skills they need, and 27% of those were experiencing moderate or severe skills shortages. Due to these staff shortages, leaders are reluctant to remove poor employees, which can impact productivity, staff morale, brand, and potentially client service. A further factor is that employees' work-life balance expectations have changed following lockdown and working from home. And if employers are unable to fulfil and meet these needs, employees are heading towards the recruitment market. The March 22 KPMG and REC UK report backs this up and noted that whilst there was a further marked increase in vacancy growth during February, candidate availability declined at a sharp and accelerated rate, the quickest since November 21. A combination of robust demand for employees and low supply has led to further upward pressure on rates of starting pay. Salaries for new permanent joiners rose at the second fastest rate in over 24 years of their data collection. So let's just have a quick look at the benefits of getting attraction and retention right. Capacity, capability, and potential for growth are more predictable. You retain knowledge, experience, and skill, which takes considerable time to rebuild, and succession planning is enhanced by growing your own talent. You become known as an employer of choice in your field and locality, and as a result, there is a reduction in cost, and it's worth noting the average cost of losing a key person is 3 times their annual salary. Employees leave their jobs for all sorts of reasons. Some departures are as a result of decisions made by employers, while others are based on employee decisions to resign and move on. Monitoring both your turnover rates and reasons why employees leave your organisation will lay the groundwork for developing your strategy to retain staff. Exit interviews are one way to achieve this. And for those of you who have not conducted exit interviews, they're a way of establishing reasons for leaving and your employees' experience of working for your business. Retention starts with recruitment, and with the race for top talent, businesses need to rethink how they attract prospective employees. The CIPD's 21 resourcing and talent planning survey found over 2/3 of businesses surveyed took an ad hoc approach to recruitment. Given the pool of skilled workers is reducing and the time to hire increasing, a more proactive approach is required. This slide shows the most effective attraction methods over the last 12 months based on the CIPD's latest findings. You would expect to see use of own websites, social media, word of mouth, and agencies towards the top of the list. But what I found interesting was the advertising roles as open to flexible working arrangements making a first appearance, as well as the number of businesses increasingly using professional or employee referral schemes. Other strategies being adapted by businesses are reaching out to career leavers, offering mid-career change programs, building links with schools, colleges, and universities, and making use of government schemes such as modern apprenticeships. Others are taking a more proactive approach and building future talent pipelines so that candidates are ready to join them when the need arises. Using the likes of LinkedIn and arranging coffee chats when potential candidates submit unsolicited CVs will help you build a talent pipeline for the future. Given candidates can receive several job offers, it is also important that you take every opportunity to sell your organisation throughout the recruitment process. There are multiple touch points in a candidate's journey, which will help you create an outstanding candidate experience. So some tips to consider. If you have a website, let that showcase your organisation. Add useful resources, upload employee stories and experiences, as well as information about your CSR commitments. Social media is increasingly becoming a critical tool in attraction. LinkedIn and other sites were number 2 in the CIPD survey. Use these tools to raise awareness of your employer brand and make sure your own LinkedIn profile is kept up to date and that you engage with passive candidates. Candidates spend an average 14 seconds looking at a job advert before deciding whether to apply. So make sure your job stands out. Consider rewording your job advert and descriptions to showcase the personality of your organisation. Some businesses are now using videos or podcasts to highlight the roles. Candidates no longer have the patience to spend 3 hours filling out an application form, so simplify your application process and acknowledge receipt of all applications. This sounds like a simple thing to do, and yet most businesses rarely do it. If you consider the time and effort a candidate has put into applying for a role with you, then take the time to send an acknowledgement. Rethink your selection process so you can begin to look beyond educational qualifications, years of experience, and sector-specific skills. Consider the best selection methods to determine how someone will perform in the role rather than how they are at interview. And also think about the number of stages you require, as candidates are no longer prepared to wait in this competitive market. Consider owning your Glassdoor page. Candidates are using Glassdoor more and more to research future employers, so make your page work for you. And encourage your current team to do a review on your own Glassdoor account. Many organisations are now using their positive Glassdoor ratings on job adverts as a way to build their employer brand. And finally, consider launching an employee referral scheme. It can give you access to a bigger pool of potential talent. It can decrease hire time, save money, and research has shown that candidates referred to the business are more likely to stay with the business longer. I'd like to spend the next few minutes exploring a number of key steps you may wish to consider when building your retention strategy. Step 1 is to develop a positive organisational culture. Workplace culture is a less tangible factor for employers to address than HR policies like flexible working or recruitment, but can have a major impact on whether or not employees are happy at their place of work and ultimately their decision to stay or leave. People quit bosses, not companies. Therefore, strong leadership, cultural identity, and a supportive, diverse, and inclusive work environment can have a significant impact on staff morale and retention of talent. Depending on the level of trust, you can find out what your employees think about working for your organisation through employee engagement surveys, focus groups, or stay interviews. Step 2 is onboarding. A well-designed onboarding program can make a real difference to an employee's experience of their new employer, and it can have a significant impact on engagement and retention. An effective onboarding program should start before the employee's first day. This could be to deal with much of the onboarding paperwork prior to joining, which cuts down on the HR induction and admin time. It lets the new employee know what to expect on their first day and who they will be meeting, what the dress code is, and showcase the organisation's supportive culture by sharing the onboarding plan ahead of the recruit's start date. You may wish to consider providing a buddy who can answer day-to-day queries and introduce the new employee to other team members to help support them in the first weeks of employment. Or perhaps encourage your team to link in with the new recruit and say hello before they start to make them feel welcome. If you build in regular communications, such as weekly check-ins and probationary reviews, this gives the opportunity for two-way feedback and ensures the success of the onboarding. Step 3 is career development. A lack of career development opportunities, learning opportunities, or a visible and achievable path to promotion are all big red flags from a retention perspective. And according to Tiny Pulse's 2019 Employee Engagement Report, the company's research found that people who don't feel supported in their professional development are 3 times more likely to be job hunting. Transparent career pathways and milestones are critical if you wish to engage and retain your top and emerging talent. However, a career path may be blocked for a multitude of reasons, and to reinforce how valuable an employee is to the organisation, alternatives to be considered include lateral moves, stretch assignments, project-based work, job swaps, mentoring and coaching and development opportunities, which gives employees a chance to expand their skills and network with a new circle of employees and clients. Other points to consider are appraisals. People like to know how they are perceived both as a person and as an employee. And traditional performance management meetings at half and full year can be effective. There is, however, a move towards more fluidity and agility through ongoing regular career conversations, which helps create and drive a high-performing culture. Access to training and development opportunities not only help employees to improve their knowledge and skills, but can also increase engagement and retention. Continuous training using mechanisms such as online courses, webinars, and formal training programs are effective ways to achieve that training. Step 4 is communication and engagement. People working in businesses crave communication. If this communication is not effective through the formal channels, then informal channels such as water cooler chats or grapevines become more important, and employers then have difficulty controlling the communication flow. Regular communication between an organisation and its employees can produce benefits for all, including improved motivation and commitment, better management decisions, increased understanding about management decisions or the need for change, and increased levels of trust and improved working relationships. So a few top tips to consider. Communication should be frequent and transparent. The pandemic helped underscore the importance of good workplace communication. Employees should feel that they can come to their line manager with ideas, questions, and concerns at any time. And leaders need to make sure that they're doing their part to help promote timely, constructive, and positive communication across the entire team. This can stop small problems escalating and provide employees with an ongoing platform to share their thoughts. You may wish to consider using regular feedback activities such as pulse surveys or create a digital suggestion box. Asking your employees for their feedback more frequently will give you quick and real-time insights that will help you develop meaningful interventions. It is important to follow up on points raised, and a simple tool of "you said, we did" ensure employees have a voice and are listened to. And you may wish to think about conducting stay interviews or engagement check-ins. I mentioned exit interviews earlier, and these are pretty common tools. While they can glean essential information, they can come too late to retain valuable employees. Stay interviews or engagement check-ins are designed to engage employees before they become dissatisfied. There are lots of ways you can use these to have a positive impact on retention and engagement. You may want to use them for targeted groups such as key or emerging talent, problem areas, new joiners, or your whole organisation. They can help you build greater insights, both about the individual, but also your employer brand. And they should be a conversation between line manager and their employees. If you wish it to feel less formal, you could suggest to managers that they try out a stay question in one of their normal check-ins, asking questions which explore factors that make employees want to stay with the organisation, make them feel listened to and valued, as well as triggers which may cause them to leave. There are a few suggested questions up on the slide, but you should adapt these to meet the needs of your organisation. Step 5 is flexible working. Flexible working practices are another important way for employers to attract and, just as importantly, retain a diverse range of employees. The traditional 9-to-5 pattern of working no longer suits everyone. Increasingly, more employees, and not only those with caring responsibilities, expect to achieve more flexibility in their working lives to accommodate their personal commitments. It is an expectation now rather than a wish. Offering flexible working arrangements is a direct way of helping staff to achieve a better balance between their work and home lives, which can boost their loyalty and commitment to your organisation. So some ideas to consider. If appropriate, use the tagline "Happy to talk flexible working" when advertising your vacancies. Consider a hybrid approach to working if your organisation and job roles can support some remote working. And review your flexible working policies and practices to ensure they are fit for purpose and afford choice. Flexible working isn't just about hybrid approach. Do you offer flexibility in hours, such as compressed hours, job sharing, or staggered start and finish times? This is particularly important for the substantial number of employees who are unable to work remotely and need to attend to the workplace. Finally, step 6 is health and well-being. It's generally recognised that poor leadership and some poor employees can negatively impact on the retention of good people. Employees often leave an organisation for reasons directly related to ill health. For example, a new job may make it easier to manage a health problem through flexible working, or for a well-being issue, such as an employee feeling bullied at work or feeling that they are under too much pressure in their job. It is possible to identify and address these types of issues through regular communication or stay conversations with your employees. Employers put a lot of effort into employee wellbeing initiatives, but they can be expensive and sometimes feel a bit superficial. The experience of having a manager that genuinely cares about their employees' health and well-being goes much further than free fruit. So some ideas to consider and help you get health and well-being ingrained in your culture without the big budget. Create a wellbeing policy identifying wellbeing issues and initiatives to be addressed, such as stress, bullying, substance misuse, financial difficulties. Run a lunch and learn for your managers on the importance of showing an interest in their team's health and wellbeing, and encourage them to add a couple of wellbeing questions in their regular one-to-one check-ins. As stated, being flexible about how your people work can really help employee engagement and performance. And you could ask your team through a quick survey what would help. Are there ways of working that are causing unnecessary stress or frustration? It may be something easy to fix. There's a lot of free support available, and you can empower your employees to take control of their own health and well-being by signposting them to services such as working health services, healthy working lives, mental health apps, and debt counselling, etc. Even better, get your own people to share their favourites. Employee assistance programs can be costly, but they offer great health and financial well-being advice and often include confidential counselling support too. And finally, create a calendar of events that support employees throughout the year with fun activities or signposting guidance on a particular subject. It's a seller's market at the moment, and as employers, we need to be doing all we can to retain our top talent. Many of you may have some of these initiatives in place already, but I hope there are some useful takeaways to help you address your key attraction and retention concerns. Thank you. I'll now hand you over to Jack.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Please bear with me while I share my screen, and hopefully I can do this without too much of a hiccup. Here we go. So this is my slideshow. Good morning, folks. Thanks very much to Henderson Logie for having me along to speak to you on this event this morning. My name is Jack Boyle, and as Suzanne said, I'm a director in the employment team at Blackadder's and also a trustee at the Dundee Carers Centre. My talk this morning is an update on employment law, and for that, I'm going to focus on two main areas this morning. The first one, I'm going to speak about employment contracts, and secondly, I'm going to look a little bit more detail about flexible working arrangements. So let me start by looking at employment contracts. Probably not the most glamorous topic, I would say, however, a very important topic nonetheless. In my view, the employment contract is the most important document in the employment relationship, apart from maybe the payslip if you're the employee. The employment contract is kind of the first port of call certainly for me and my team whenever we're approached by a client who maybe has a dispute. The first thing we want to see is the employment contract. So what am I going to cover this morning? Well, I thought firstly I would do a very quick refresher of the basics and the legal requirements around employment contracts. Then I'll talk briefly about the timing in terms of when do you have to implement your employment contracts. Now, there were quite a few changes implemented exactly 2 years ago, back in April 2020. And I've got a feeling that these changes to a certain extent kind of slipped off the radar because of the events of the pandemic and the furlough scheme and all of those things that employers and employees were having worries about and having to get to grips with. So I'm just going to touch a base on those changes. Then I will look at the concept of whether there are actually any sanctions for an employer which fails to meet its legal obligations. And lastly, I'll offer up some practical pointers which may be of interest in relation to contracts. Okay, so here's a quick refresher of the basics. So the law, and I'm not going to quote much law, you'll be glad to hear, but the law on this issue does stem from Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act, which says that every employer must issue every employee with a statement of particulars of employment. Now, when I'm talking through this talk this morning about employment contracts, I'm really talking about statement of particulars of employment. The two terms are interchangeable. I just prefer to say employment contract because it's slightly easier to say. So that's a legal requirement. Every employee has to be issued with one of these. The law also prescribes a minimum of 13 essential matters that have to be detailed in the contract. Some of these are fairly obvious, such as hours of work, rate of pay or salary, details of holiday, but there are also other niche things such as pension details, details of training, details of any collective agreements. So the law sets out the minimum components. Another thing that's also important is if there is a change to the individual's terms and conditions. So for example, if there's a pay rise or there's maybe a flexible working request which gets approved and a change to the hours of work, these have to be notified to the employee. And in my view, you don't have to issue a new contract every time something minor changes, but instead you could issue the employee with a letter or even an email, which serves as a written variation to their terms and conditions. So that's the legal background. What about timing? When does the employer have to issue these employment contracts? So ever since I've been doing this for employment law for the last 10 or 12 years, the employers always had a little bit of a margin for error in that there was a 2-month grace period. So traditionally, the employer had a period of 2 months after the employee started within which to issue the employment contract. However, in April 2020, that was changed, and the employment contract now has to be issued on or prior to the employee commencing work. So that means the employer has to get the ducks in a row early doors, and the contract has to be issued at the latest when the employee has their first day of work. Another change which was also implemented 2 years ago was the requirement that contracts have to be issued not only to employees, but they also have to be issued to workers as well. Now, a worker is a kind of there's 3 classes of worker or employee. You've got the self-employed people, who basically don't have any rights under the Employment Rights Act, the employees who have the most rights, and then there's this kind of middle category of worker who maybe don't have the full obligations of an employee, maybe a little bit more ad hoc. They can pick and choose there when they want to work. They don't have to work a shift if they're offered it. These guys, these workers, they never used to have to be given contracts, but now they do as well. So that's just another pointer if you happen to have any workers within your charity. So here's a further look at the April 2020 changes. I know for a fact that these have slipped off the radar because I would say the majority of contracts that pass my desk don't include these changes, and they should. But here's what they say. So firstly, any probation period has to be written into the contract. I don't think that's a great news story. I think most employers probably were doing that anyway, but nonetheless it now has to be written into the contract. Details of any training. So for example, if there's mandatory training, I know that I have to do CPD 20 hours a year. Things like that have to now be expressly written into the contract. And also if there's any training that the employee is going to have to fund themselves, that has to be written into the contract. Details of any paid types of leave is another new element. So it used to be the case that things like statutory rights for maternity pay or adoptive pay, things like that, you didn't have to write those in the contract because they were statutory. But now they do have to be mentioned and expressly narrated in the contract. Similarly, details of any benefits. So again, many employers used to have maybe a staff handbook, or there would be details of benefits are available on demand from HR or something like that. Now under the new law, that's not good enough, and the Act says that every benefit that applies has to be written in the contract for clarity. And then the final of the April 2020 changes, the contract has to specify the hours and days of the week which the worker or employee is required to work. And importantly, if these hours are subject to change or if they can be varied, how can that be done? So again, for example, if there's a rota in place or something like that, that has to be mentioned in the contract. Now, I'm going to move to the next slide. I'm often asked by clients, do I really have to bother getting employment contracts in place? And of course, I'm going to say yes to that as an employment lawyer, but that is the true answer as well. And I would say there are two main reasons for that. The first reason, the employment contract is a management tool as well as a legal requirement. If you're having problems with an employee, there's a fair chance that the employment contract is going to be the starting point for trying to address any disputes. Perhaps more importantly, there's a financial penalty available to an employee who has not been issued with a compliant contract, and that comes from the Section 38 of the Employment Act. Any employee who has not been issued with a written contract can raise a claim to the Employment Tribunal against their employer for a failure to issue a contract. If the judge finds the claim to be well-founded, the judge has the ability, indeed the judge must make an award of either 2 or 4 weeks gross pay per employee. So again, if it's an organisation which has not bothered to issue contracts at all, then the numbers could tot up if it's a large number of employees who do not have their employment contracts. So that's the explanation why you have to issue an employment contract and why it's good practice to do it. It's a legal requirement at the end of the day. My final point on employment contracts is just a couple of practical pointers that are based on recent examples of cases that I've been involved in. The first one I would say is relation to holidays. So holidays is one of the things which have to be clearly narrated in the contract. We had a client who inadvertently drafted their contracts and gave the individuals they meant to give them 28 days holiday, but by mistake, they gave them 36 days. They had written in the contract that you are entitled to 28 days holiday plus public holidays. The word plus was, of course, the wrong word to use. They should have said 28 days inclusive of public holidays. Now, that was a rare example. It's not something I see very often. I've only seen it once. But even on public holidays, make sure that the drafting's clear so that you know if public holidays are included with an overall holiday entitlement. It's a good idea, in my view, to list all of the public holidays that you as an employer recognise. If you simply say, you know, you get 20 days holiday plus all public holidays. Well, think about May or June this year when there's a couple of bonus public holidays. If the contract says you get all public holidays, then automatically your staff are going to have to get the time off for the Queen's Jubilee, I think it is, where there's a couple of extra days. Whereas if you say you get 8 public holidays, then you've at least got the discretion whether or not to award these additional bonus days. Probation periods is another point I would like to cover. Typically, probation periods are fairly common in my experience, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, to allow the employer to assess the new employee and whether they are really, you know, going to cut the mustard long term. If you're including a probation period, make sure that during the probation period, you include an ability to terminate the employment on a fairly short notice period, say 1 week, in my view. I had a client last year who had an employee with a very long notice period. It was a senior employee with a 6-month notice period. They had a 6-month probation clause. Things weren't working out after 2 months. They knew already, we don't want to be tied with this employee long term. Let's end the probation. We'll get rid of them. That'll be easy. And they came to us and they said, Jack, this is easy, isn't it? I'll just get rid of them and it won't cost me anything. I looked at the contract. There was no clause that says we can dismiss you on short notice during probation. So I told them, you're going to have to pay 6 months notice. They went berserk, and thankfully I hadn't drafted that contract, so I didn't have to put my head in my hands completely. However, that was just an example. Make sure that your probation periods are clear and that they do have a shorter notice period to give you that flexibility. Also, on the theme of termination of employment, I'll just say a brief word about payments in lieu of notice. It's quite common where an employee has a notice period and they either resign or they are dismissed. The employer maybe doesn't want to have that person hanging about for 3 months, making mischief or stealing confidential information or whatever. And it's quite often a useful mechanism to say, just go now, we'll pay you in lieu of your notice. You don't have to serve your notice. Now, if the contract provides for that, that's good, because it has to provide for that if you want to utilize that option. But some employees have a pay packet which is made up of numerous components. Maybe you've got a basic salary, maybe there's like a car allowance, maybe there's insurances and other benefits and other perks, bonuses. If you've got a payment in lieu of notice clause, you're going to have to include all of these additional elements unless you say otherwise. So again, it's a good idea to say, to keep costs down, to say that in a payment of lieu of notice, your pay will be based on basic salary only and will not include other benefits like car allowance, etc., etc. Because otherwise, if you don't include that clause and you don't pay for these additional elements, that will give rise to a breach of contract. And then last point is an easy one, but it's an important one, is about deduction from wages. There are certain circumstances where an employer may wish to deduct sums from an employee's wages. That's unlawful unless it's been agreed in writing in advance. And the easiest way to do that is to include a clause in the employment contract that gives you, the employer, the right to make these deductions. So include that in the contract. Even if you're not going to use it regularly, it's one of those things that it's worth having in there just in case, because you never know when you might mistakenly overpay an employee for holiday pay, for example. So that concludes the first aspect of my talk, and the longer aspect you'll be glad to hear. The second part I'm going to focus on is, it kind of dovetails with what Fiona was saying earlier. It's around flexible working. I'm going to look at it from the angle, firstly from the angle of the statutory right to request flexible working. So this is kind of the employee-driven process, whereby it used to be only parents and carers had this right, but a good few years ago now, the government did away with those requirements, and now any individual employee can make a statutory flexible working request. The only requirement is a need to have 26 weeks continuous employment. If you've been there for 26 weeks, you can make a flexible working request for any reason. You know, you maybe want time off to walk the dog, or you want a better work-life balance, or I don't know, the World Cup's on and you want to catch some of the matches. You know, you can make a request for any reason now. There was previously a statutory procedure which was quite cumbersome. I'm glad to report that that's been abolished, and now the law simply says that an employer has to deal with a request in a reasonable manner. A lot more flexible. There is a time scale. If you receive a flexible request in a statutory form, you have to give an answer within 3 months. So that's plenty of time in my view. You can of course dispose of it in a quicker period. And I think in most cases it probably will be done quicker. Here's what the ACAS code says the employer has to do. Discuss the request with the employee, consider it carefully, and deal with it promptly. Pretty vague in my view, but again, that does give the employer a little bit more leeway of how to determine a flexible request. Another important point, just an observation, an employee is only allowed one statutory flexible request in a 12-month period. So they can't make them every other month and continue to chop and change their hours if they want to rely on the statutory scheme. It's often a misconception among employees, certainly employees that phone me, they seem to think that it's a statutory right to have flexible working. It's not, it's a statutory right to request it. There is a difference. An employer can refuse a flexible working request. If you receive a request and you're minded to refuse it, however, don't just say something like, it's a 9-to-5 job, it can't be done, or we don't recognize flexible working. The reason has to be shoehorned into one of these 8 legal reasons, which are on the slide just now. I'm not going to read them all out because I'm starting to get a tickle in my throat, and also I'm happy for my slides to be made available to you after the event. But if you wish to reject a request, it has to be one of those 8 reasons. Otherwise, an employee can make a claim, and I believe it's 8 weeks compensation that they can get for a failure in that respect. So really, just to summarise in respect of what I've been saying about flexible working, as Fiona rightly said, flexible working arrangements can be done informally as well, and probably in my experience that's becoming almost the norm now, that these things are being done more informally rather than telling the employee put it in writing and do it formally. So all I would say is, if you do feel you're getting bogged down with too many flexible requests and it's becoming difficult to manage, you can still direct your employees to the flexible statutory procedure, and that does limit them to 1 request per annum. If that's more suitable to it all depends on the size of the organisation and the ability of the team to cope. Another one that often happens in oops, sorry, I've just gone too far ahead, is that a flexible working arrangement gets agreed, they have a meeting, they do all the procedure correct, and then they forget to document the arrangements. It just gets told verbally to the employee, and that's of course going to give rise to problems in the future potentially. So for example, if you decide to say to the employee, you know what, I'm not sure that this is going to work, but I'm willing to give it a go. I'll allow you a trial period of 6 months. If it's not working at the end of 6 months, you'll have to revert back to your old hours. Again, that often happens and the employer doesn't put it in writing, and that's problematic because then you get into an issue of, well, was that really agreed? So whatever you do with a flexible working request, always put the outcome in writing, ideally as a written variation to the contract. And a final word just about hybrid working, which is a fairly new concept that we've all, I'm sure, been exposed to some degree through the pandemic. In my experience so far, it seems to be something which is not being left to the employees to request. It's more something which I think most employers are grasping the nettle with and implementing at a company-wide level, whether that be, for example, introducing your own hybrid working policy, giving the staff the option to opt in. You know, I think a lot of organisations will have taken vast leaps forward in terms of flexible working arrangements. We've kind of had our hand forced because of the pandemic. A lot of employers, I think, who were perhaps reluctant to let individuals work from home. The pandemic, for many jobs, you didn't have a choice. And so it was either that or your person can't work and you have to furlough them. So in my experience, there are a lot more organisations embracing flexible working, and I think that's a good thing. I think having a policy would be my message. Have a policy so that there's transparency and that your staff know. For example, our receptionists who have to be here to meet and greet clients, it's unfortunate for them, but they can't really work from home because they need to be in the building. And again, so the policy should make clear whether certain jobs, for example, are not eligible for hybrid working. So that concludes my presentation this morning, folks. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks again to Henderson Logie for having me along. There's a link to my Twitter handle. If you are active on Twitter and you would like to give me a follow, please do. I sometimes tweet about employment stuff and sometimes about fishing as well. So I'd be glad to receive a follow, and I'm more than happy to follow you back. But for now, I'll say cheers and cheerio.
That was great. Thank you, Jack. And also thank you to you, Fiona. That was really, really interesting and some really useful tips in there. I think we'll have a look and see what questions have come through. Let's see what the first one is. Fiona, in your experience, what's the most common reason that staff leave?
Various reasons, really, but certainly at the moment, given the significant starting salaries that are being offered, pay is one of the key reasons people are moving on at the moment, along with flexible working requests, as I mentioned in my section, but also career development opportunities. If people aren't getting those opportunities within the current with their current employer, then they are actively seeking opportunities elsewhere.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, Jack, we've got one here for you. With the changes in contracts of employment which came into force during the pandemic, what advice would you give to those who have not already considered this?
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, I would say that whoever asked that question is probably not alone. I think a lot of employers it did slip off the radar because the furlough scheme and all the other stuff that was going on just went to the top of the pile, and so much other stuff went to the bottom of the pile. The short answer would be address it now, get your contracts revised and add those essential, I think it's 4 or 5 items, get those added in now and reissue them to your staff so that you're not exposed to a potential legal breach.
Okay. That's helpful. Okay, and Fiona, I think we've got another one here for you. If there was one area that the trustees should take away from today's session, what would that be?
That is quite a difficult one to answer because I think each organisation will have their own, their own issues that they are having to address. I think be proactive in terms of your attraction and retention strategies, but also communicate with your teams, particularly those individuals that you identify as being key talent for the future, so that you understand what they are thinking about their roles and the organisation.
Okay. Good. And Jack, I think maybe just one more. You'd mentioned, and this is actually probably more of a question from me than anybody else. You'd mentioned about self-employment and employees and the workers in the middle. Who would typically fall into that category?
Yep. Thanks very much, Suzanne. That's a great question, and I think it's one of the trickiest areas of employment law. This sort of 3 category. You probably know that in like tax law, there is only 2 categories. You're either employed or self-employed. Mm-hmm. So employment law just like to make things difficult. To answer the question, it's not always an easy one to label. I would say it's generally speaking, the tribunals approach it as in, if you get a good pass to all the various tests, you'll be an employee. If you get not so good a pass, you'll be a worker. And the things that we're generally looking at are things like, does the person have to personally provide their services? And is there mutual obligations on both sides? So for me, I have to come in Blackadder's at 9 and stay till 5 at least. I can't decide, I'm not really want to come in today. So I've got personal obligation, and Blackadders have to give me work between 9 till 5 too. They can't just say, Jack, we're quiet today, you can just go home. A worker would usually be somebody that does have a bit more flexibility there, that they can refuse maybe an assignment So you're maybe like your 0 hours workers might fall into that category, Suzanne, or some people that do, you know, bank workers or relief workers that they're sometimes called, people where there's, you know, there's not an obligation to attend work, but if the employer offers them the work, they can say yes or no, I'm going to do that, or I'm not going to do it. The workers, they don't have the full rights of an employee, but they still have to get things like minimum wage, holiday pay, pension, things that a self-employed person doesn't get.
Okay, that was really good. We also have another question here. I'll open up to both of you. Home working doesn't suit every employee or employer. How should an employer deal with an employee who refuses to return to the workplace if the employer feels that it's required for the role to be carried out effectively? This might be a question that might get taken offline, but I don't know if there's anything anybody would like to comment on there.
I'm happy to have a stab at it, Suzanne.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the starting point, as I said earlier, is the employment contract. So see what the employment contract says. One of the essential components that I didn't mention is place of work. So my place of work, my contract still says Reform Street, Dundee. See what your contract says. If the place of work is your charity's headquarters, then that employee, in my view, has to attend where you tell them to work, because that's what the contract says. I suppose the only things to maybe think about, if the employee has a disability, for example, or if they have concerns about health and safety. There was a lot of chat going on, and I did experience issues where employees were reluctant to return from home working because they either genuinely, I'm sure in some cases, or just not so genuine in other cases, they had fears about catching COVID and they were worried about coming to the workplace. I think in that situation, I would always advise the client to go to extra lengths to explain to the employee all of the measures that you've taken to make your workplace safe. You know, so we've got distancing, we've got regular sanitization, we all have to wear masks walking about the corridor. I think that reason is going to become less and less valid as time moves on, and more people have been vaccinated as well. So I think that that's a problem. But ultimately, I think if push comes to shove, if you can't engage in a meaningful dialogue, appease the employee of their concerns and persuade them that, you know, their contractual place of work is the office, you may have to go in with the stick, which is perhaps, well, that's an insubordination if you're not returning to work when you're instructed to do so, and that ultimately becomes a matter of discipline.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's a pretty comprehensive response to the question, and I think it is understanding why the employee doesn't want to come back into the office or the workplace, and then reassuring them and trying to come up with solutions to help them if it's possible to do so.
Sure. Okay, couple more. We have somebody who's a trustee in a charity and about to employ somebody, and are writing a job description. So they're wondering when you would raise all the contract issues along with the job description. Would you discuss that at the interview stage?
Sorry, can you just say that again, Suzanne?
There's a trustee in a charity and they're about to recruit somebody and are currently writing the job description. And they're wondering at what point would you discuss the contract issues in the job description? Would you cover any of that off at the interview stage, or would that part of that be afterwards?
Generally, and Jack, I'm more than happy for you to correct me here, but generally I would hold off on any sort of contractual elements until the job offer stage. It's not really something that I would incorporate into the job description or as part of the actual conversation, you know, the job interview, unless there's obviously specific requirements such as traveling or, you know, where the individual will be required to work, then obviously I would explore that further as part of the job interview.
Okay.
I would absolutely agree with all of that as well. Yeah, those kind of feel like the sort of issues you would keep for the job offer once you've got to the stage that you want to offer the job to that person.
Okay, fantastic. And we have a question from a trustee as well. So that basically saying that trustees might have a wide range of experience, and they're wondering whether they're allowed to help support staff or should it be left to a named line manager. They've said danger of rule and divide. So I don't know who would maybe want to pick that up.
I'm happy to have a stab at it. If that suits, I would think that both approaches, in my view, are okay. I think if there's at the first instance, I think the line manager would typically, or maybe if there is somebody in the org, I know that not all organisations are large enough to have, for example, somebody who deals with HR or something of that nature, but a line manager would be perhaps a good first port of call to deal with welfare issues or things like that in the workplace. Of course, sometimes welfare issues stem from problems with your line manager, so that's not always going to work. And so if you can appoint a neutral person within the organisation to be that sort of sympathetic ear, then that's a good move. But equally, don't see anything hugely inappropriate with a trustee doing that. I mean, I'm a trustee myself. I think it's ultimately a judgment call. You know, I think if they want to be sympathetic, because as a trustee, you are essentially part of the employer. But equally, on the same hand, you probably don't want to get too personally involved or too close with any employees of the organisation. I think that would be problematic. And if there was, thinking from my job as an employment lawyer, if there was to be a tribunal claim going forward, the last thing you probably want to get to happen to you is to be dragged into the witness box and be cross-examined by an employee who said, "Oh, Jack, remember that time that you took me out for coffee and you put your arm around me and said, 'Don't worry, everything will be all right.'" So on balance, as I talk it through myself and think it through, I think it would be preferable for you to delegate that function to somebody within your staff.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. I suppose it gives that kind of structure, doesn't it, as well, you know, in these kinds of matters as well. So, you know, that's good. Thank you for that, Jack. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that we've got for today. You will all receive a copy of the recording and our contact details as well. So I'd like to finish off by saying a big thank you to you all for joining us today. And hopefully you found it helpful. And also to Jack and Fiona for speaking today. I'm sure you'll all agree they've done a fantastic job. So thank you, and hopefully you'll be able to join us at our next trustee training or charity training webinar that's coming up shortly.